He was there when the cameras turned off, when the doors closed, and when secrets stayed buried in silence. But now, at 87 years old, Whispering Bill Anderson finally opens up about the man who stood just behind him in the shadows, Jimmy Capps. Why did Anderson keep quiet for so long? What truths were too painful to speak until now? Stay with me, because this story doesn't just reveal the sound behind the words. It changes the way we see both of these men forever. The story begins in Nashville, 1962. The city was buzzing. Country music was in the middle of a revolution. Studios working late into the night, and stars trying to carve out their place on the charts. Bill Anderson, still in his 20s, had already proven himself as a songwriter. His song City Lights had been recorded by Ray Price and climbed all the way to #1. Suddenly, Anderson wasn't just another hopeful with a guitar. He was someone people respected. But writing was only half the dream. Anderson wanted to be known as a performer in his own right. He had the words, he had the voice, but he didn't yet have the sound. That's where fate stepped in. On a humid summer night, Anderson walked into a modest Nashville studio, ready to cut a new track. Nothing about that evening looked unusual. Producers chatted, engineers adjusted levels, musicians tuned up. But in that corner stood a 23-year-old guitarist from Benson, North Carolina, Jimmy Capps. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, he simply adjusted the strings on his guitar with the calm confidence of someone who already belonged. And then when the music began, something shifted. Anderson noticed it immediately. The arrangement suddenly felt alive, richer, warmer. The lines Capps played weren't trying to steal the spotlight. They didn't scream for attention. Instead, they slipped into the track like a hidden heartbeat, steady, melodic, unforgettable. At that moment, Bill Anderson knew. From that day forward, he would ask for Jimmy Capps at every session. Their connection was instant but not loud. That first meeting didn't come with fireworks or headlines. It came with subtlety, exactly the quality that would define both of their careers. Anderson with his poetic delivery, and Capps with his intuitive playing fit together like pieces of the same instrument. Many producers would later comment that they seemed to communicate without words. A glance, a nod, a single strum, and they understood each other. That chemistry, born in a small studio, would end up shaping decades of music. One story from those early sessions tells it all. Anderson brought in a song he wasn't sure about. He doubted its structure, unsure if it would land the way he hoped. Capps, quiet as always, sat with his guitar and began strumming something soft and moody, something not written anywhere. Anderson froze, listened, and whispered, "That's it, don't change a thing." That song went on to become a defining moment in Anderson's early solo career. Years later, he would say, "I had the words, but Jimmy gave them a home." Together, they started crafting a sound that was unlike anything else on the radio. Anderson's voice wasn't about power or volume. He wasn't trying to belt out songs like his contemporaries. His strength was in the storytelling, in whispering a line so that it felt like he was speaking directly into the listener's ear. But to make that work, the music behind him had to be delicate, precise, and emotional. That's where Jimmy Capps became irreplaceable. The perfect example came in 1963. When Anderson recorded Still, the song became his signature. On the surface, it was Bill's aching lyrics and heartfelt performance that drove it to the top. But listen closely, and you'll hear what truly carried it. The guitar underneath. Jimmy's playing was so subtle, it felt as if the strings themselves were sighing along with the word. That one recording didn't just hit #1 on the country charts. It crossed into the pop top 10. It was proof that when Anderson's words met Capps' guitar, they created something timeless. And it wasn't just songs like "Po' Folks," "Mama Sang a Song," and "I Get the Fever." All bore the fingerprints of Jimmy Capps. He never demanded credit, never fought for the spotlight, but his sound shaped the emotional core of those records. Studio engineers said he rarely needed more than one take. He would listen once, pause for a moment, then simply play, and it was always right. He wasn't reading notes. He was reading the room, reading the singer, reading the song. That kind of instinct can't be taught. But their story wasn't only written in studio. It was also forged on the road. The 1970s and 1980s were grueling years for country musicians. Tours weren't glamorous private jets or luxury hotels. They were long drives, broken-down buses, unpredictable weather, and fans who expected perfection night after night. Bill, as the frontman, carried enormous pressure. The lights, the interviews, the endless demand to deliver. But behind him, just off to the side, always steady, was Jimmy Cap. On those buses late at night between small towns, you could always find him, sometimes strumming quietly, sometimes helping a younger bandmate through a tough patch, but never complaining. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He was the anchor. Bill would later admit that even in the loneliest moments of the road, when the weight of it all felt heavy, Jimmy's presence was enough. He didn't need to talk. He didn't need to offer advice. Just being there was everything. There's one story from a Texas tour that shows this perfectly. Hours before a show, the band's equipment truck broke down. Panic spread. Crew members shouted. Tempers flared. And it seemed like the performance would be canceled. But Jimmy, calm as ever, took out his guitar, sat on a stool and started to play. Bill joined him, then the rest of the band. They performed an impromptu acoustic set outside the venue, fans sitting on the grass, clapping along. That night became one of the most memorable shows of the tour, not because of lights or staging, but because of its heart. That was Jimmy's gift, turning chaos into connection. Off stage, he carried the same quiet strength. After long shows, the crew would crowd into diners laughing over late-night biscuits and coffee. Jimmy wasn't the loudest at the table, but when he spoke, everyone listened. His humor was gentle, never cruel, always perfectly timed. He could deliver one line that left the whole group laughing. And for Bill, his presence was more than comfort. It was safety. He once said he always felt better stepping on stage knowing Jimmy was there. Not because he feared mistakes, but because with Jimmy by his side, he knew everything would be okay. It's rare to find that kind of trust in music. Egos clash, fame divides. But somehow these two men built a friendship that outlasted it all. They weren't chasing headlines or competing for the spotlight. They were craftsmen, creating something that would outlive them both. But even the strongest music has to face silence. And when that silence came, it shook Bill Anderson to his core. But every melody eventually fades. And in 2020, the stage grew quieter than ever. On the first day of June, the country music world felt an absence, so heavy that even silence seemed loud. Jimmy Capps, the gentle force behind thousands of songs, was no longer standing in the shadows of the Opry stage. For Bill Anderson, that moment wasn't just sad, it was shattering. After more than 50 years of friendship, partnership and trust, the man who had been by his side through every high and low was suddenly gone. Bill later admitted that he didn't cry right away, not because his heart wasn't broken, but because the loss was too big to process. "I just sat there," he confessed. "I stared at the wall, not sure what to feel first." Capps had been more than a guitarist. He was part of Bill's musical DNA. The notes, the pauses, the subtle whispers of guitar that had carried Bill's words for decades were now only echoed. And yet what most fans never knew was just how deeply the two men leaned on each other through life's hardest chapters. In the early 1990s, Anderson endured a difficult divorce that drained him emotionally. He was still performing, still showing up, but inside he was exhausted. Interviews were canceled, rehearsals missed, the spark seemed dimmed. Jimmy noticed first. He didn't confront Bill with questions. He didn't force a conversation. Instead, one evening backstage, he simply handed Bill a cup of coffee and sat down beside him in silence. That moment broke through the wall. Bill later admitted it was the first time he allowed himself to cry in months. Years later, when Jimmy lost his wife Anne, the roles reversed. Friends noticed Jimmy growing even quieter, though his playing remained flawless. He smiled in interviews, but something in his eyes had changed. Bill recognized it instantly. He had seen that same look in the mirror years before. So the very next morning, Bill showed up at Jimmy's house with breakfast and 2 lawn chairs. They sat in the backyard for hours, hardly speaking at all. Healing didn't come through answers or advice. It came through presence. That's how they carried each other, quietly, faithfully, without ever needing to explain. In fact, Jimmy even considered leaving music altogether after Ann passed. He told a close friend he wasn't sure he could keep hearing the same notes anymore. But Bill wouldn't let him fade away. He wrote Jimmy a handwritten letter, ending with the words, "Your music helps others feel less alone, just like you helped me." That letter still hangs framed in the Capps family home. Even when Jimmy finally received public recognition, he remained the same humble figure. In 2014, he was inducted into the Musicians Hall of Fame. The room was filled with applause. Yet Jimmy kept his speech short. He didn't talk about himself. Instead, he thanked the joy of making music with good people. Bill Anderson sat in the audience that night, smiling with pride, but later admitted that Jimmy looked almost embarrassed by the attention. He would have rather been back in the studio, Bill said. The truest tribute came years later. After Jimmy's passing, the Grand Ole Opry made a decision that carried more weight than any award ever could. They renamed Dressing Room Number 6, the same room where Jimmy had tuned his guitar, offered encouragement to countless young musicians, and whispered quiet prayers. The Jimmy Capps Music Room. When Bill was invited to speak at the dedication, he almost declined. "I wasn't sure I could get through it," he admitted. "I didn't know if I could talk about him without breaking down." But he did. Standing in that room, surrounded by framed photos and handwritten notes, Bill didn't give a formal speech. Instead, he told us he recalled a young artist pacing backstage, nervous before his debut. Without saying a word, Jimmy had stepped over, placed a hand on the artist's shoulder, and nodded. That simple gesture gave the young man courage, and his performance that night was unforgettable. "That was Jimmy," Bill said softly. "He didn't need to talk, he just needed to be there." The room erupted in applause, not the loud, showy kind, but the quiet, emotional kind. The kind that comes when everyone is thinking of the same person, and wishing he were still there to see. There's even a small mystery inside that room. Built into the wall is a drawer that holds a single guitar pick. No one knows who placed it there, and no one touches it. Musicians say it simply belongs. Bill sometimes visits the room before performing, placing his hand on the drawer without opening it. "It helps me feel ready," he confessed. But perhaps the most personal tribute came not on stage, not at a ceremony, but during a quiet radio interview. With no cameras, no script, just raw honesty. Bill spoke words he had never shared before. His voice cracked as he admitted, "I still feel him. Sometimes I turn to say something and remember he's not there. But then again, maybe he is." He described sitting in the studio not long after Jimmy's absence. During playback of a track, the engineer swore he heard faint guitar strumming, gentle, precise, and unmistakably Jimmy's style. But no one had recorded any extra part. Bill just smiled and whispered, "I like to think he came by just one more time." Since then, Bill has carried one of Jimmy's old guitar picks in his coat pocket. Every time he steps on stage, it goes with him. He's never written a formal tribute song, not because he couldn't, but because he believes the best goodbyes don't always need to be sung. Instead, he began keeping a private notebook he calls the Book of Capps. Inside are memories, inside jokes, notes about Jimmy's subtle habits, like tapping his foot when Bill sang, or strumming a line to cover a missed beat without ever drawing attention to it. "I never got to say everything," Bill confessed, "but I hope he knows." His final words in that interview lingered like the last note of a song. "You don't just lose people like Jimmy, you learn to carry them differently." And maybe that's the greatest lesson in their story. The bond between Bill Anderson and Jimmy Capps wasn't born in applause. It was built in silence, in the pauses between notes, in the quiet presence that steadied two men through the storms of life. Today, Bill still turns to his side on stage, half expecting to see Jimmy just off in the shadows, tuning up for the next song. He doesn't see him, but in every pause, in every whisper of silence, he still feels him. And for Bill, that will always be enough.